Thank you to Yehudit and to Nadia, and there are so many distinguished people here. I won't elaborate so that I don't offend anyone. I have been here in Hebron since the afternoon hours for a few hours of recharging my batteries. We began in Bet Ezra. We went to the yeshiva. There I met with the students, and from there I went to Bet Machpela. I have the privilege of being the only minister to visit in Bet Machpela since it was closed. It's a dubious honor. I wish everyone could come. I wish it would be open to everyone. From there I went to the cave of the Patriarchs, and from there I came here. We all know the first Rashi on the Torah, that Midrash from Midrash Tanchuma, that Rashi decided to begin with, and it says, Rabbi Yitzchak said that the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. And why does the Torah start with Bereshit? In order to say that this is God's world. And if the nations of the world should come and say, you have stolen the lands of the 7 nations, they will be able to tell them, all the world belongs to the Almighty, and if He likes it, He gives it to them, and if He likes, He takes it from them and gives it to us. And these things in the Midrash, they're not theoretical. We can see it with our own eyes, that the nations of the world are indeed calling us robbers, accusing us of taking lands that belong to other nations. Unfortunately, we don't need to go so far as the nations of the world. Unfortunately, among our own people, there are those who say that we are robbers. And we say, and when we say what it says in the Torah, unfortunately, we can see that people don't care about what it says there. Is it possible that God gave us an answer to the nations of the world that people don't accept? And the answer is in the verse that appears in the Midrash. It says, He told His people about His actions. The answer here is not to the nations of the world. The nations of the world will say whatever they say. They'll say whatever they want. But these words are directed at the people of Israel. We're the ones who need to know this. And when we internalize these things, and when these things are etched in our minds, and when we are not grasshoppers in our own eyes, then too we will not be that in their eyes either. This week, the report of the committee led by Justice Edmund Levy. The members of the committee included Judge Talia Shapira and Ambassador Alan Baker. This report, as soon as I finished reading it, although it is a comprehensive report, I immediately wrote a letter to the Prime Minister and requested that the Ministerial Committee on Settlement meet and adopt this report as a binding report. Ultimately, we have a counterweight to that bizarre report known as the Talia Sasson report, a report that defines, well, if someone had taken over land illegally, but it defines communities that were established by the government, by government decision, with government funding and government encouragement, except that in the planning procedures for political reasons, or sometimes bureaucratic reasons, but most often for political reasons, a certain signature is still missing. She defined them as illegal. And when the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, requires the state to destroy homes that the state built, that the state encouraged, because they're defined as illegal. And then this report comes along, and I recommend that everyone read it. It is a report that contends with all the questions, including the most fundamental claim that according to international law, that you may not build, you may not bring in population to occupied territory. They invited and appeared before them all the representatives of all the organizations, the NGOs, both from the right and the left, and they completely refute all those claims one by one. Very simply, without getting into, of course, our historical rights, and that famous midrash in the first Rashi, but simply the state of Israel captured Judea and Samaria in the Six-Day War from Jordan, which held that land illegally. But if we did occupy it, we occupied it from Jordan, and Jordan relinquished its claim to sovereignty over those territories. In fact, the only country in the world as a state that demands sovereignty over Judea and Samaria is the state of Israel. There's no other state that demands sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. And with God's help, there will never be another state that demands sovereignty. In any case, we are the only state, and in any case, there is no reason to talk about a status of occupiers. The report contends with all the issues and all the questions. It's a very comprehensive report, and in my humble opinion, this report can indeed serve the purpose of that midrash, that we should all know what God's acts are in this world. We should all read the report and know what our rights are, written by jurists in legal terminology, not wishful thinking, but the things are very clear. So first of all, I consider that very important, and as I said, I've asked the Prime Minister that we adopt the report as a report that is binding on the government and the state prosecution. I told Yehudit that it's time to go on, or Yehudit said it's time to go on the offensive, to stop being defensive and start going on the offensive. The truth is, when I visited here today, and since I have been a member of the government for a little over 3 years, this is I don't know how many times that I've visited in Hebron, and I always enjoy visiting here. But I would prefer not to use the word offensive or attack, but rather to use what our sages said. It's not the teaching that's important, but the actions are important. The way to realize sovereignty over all parts of the land of Israel is simply to live in all parts of the land of Israel. First and foremost, not to talk. There's no problem, of course, to talk, but the problem is that talk very often ends with talk. We're good at talk, we're big heroes when it comes to talking, but the real courage and heroism is to actually go and settle. we're here in Hebron. This is the city that connects heaven and earth. When Abraham goes with the young men to sacrifice Isaac, it says he saw the place from afar. And the sages ask, what did he see? And they say, a cloud connected to the mountain. And the simple explanation is that this cloud is the divine presence. And he asks Yitzchak if he sees it, and he says that he does. And he asks the young men if they see it, and they say they do not. And in Psikta Rav Kana, quoted in Rashi, the Avram says to the young men, since you don't see it, stay here with the donkey. What was it that Abraham saw? Did he see the divine presence? Is the divine presence only on Mount Moriah? And on Mount of Olives, there isn't a divine presence? And on Mount Scopus, there isn't a divine presence? Is there anywhere in the world where the divine presence does not exist? Ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion, the key word is not cloud or divine presence, but rather a cloud that is connected to the mountain. And who connects the cloud to the mountain? The people of Israel. The divine presence is in the desert too, but when you come to the land and you plant trees, what is characteristic of the land of Israel, when the people of Israel don't live in the land of Israel, when it doesn't build or develop or invest in the land is neglected. It's a wilderness. What was here before the state was established, before 64 years ago, with only 650,000 Jews, many of them Holocaust survivors? What was there here? Nothing. A wilderness without industry or agriculture. And when the people of Israel come to the land of Israel and build the land of Israel and develop industry and health and agriculture and security, when the people of Israel put in the effort, the people of Israel connect the divine presence to the cloud. The divine presence is connected with actions. So what's important is not the talk, but the actions. But we also need the talk, the words. We have to first and foremost do the actions. What will assure our sovereignty in all parts of the land of Israel unrestricted? But we do indeed have to, if possible, it's desirable and important, again, less important than the actual settling, but important in principle, is also to declare to the world, this is the land of Israel. And there's no better declaration than by applying Israeli law, not only on the settlements, on all parts of the land of Israel. And here, from the people attending this conference, I have a request. There are people who are suggesting all kinds of compromises. Let's start with these parts or those parts. Let's do this, and then we'll get there. Yitzchak Shamir was mentioned earlier. We're still in the first 30 days after his death. There was always pressure on all of the prime ministers to declare our borders. And Yitzchak Shamir was always cautious, and other prime ministers didn't fall into that trap either, for a simple reason. The moment you have distinguished between different parts of the land of Israel, as soon as you say, let's apply the law in this part, what you have not said is understood that you don't want it, and that's what our enemies hear. Our enemies will say, we've heard what you don't want. And in those places, ladies and gentlemen, you've lost. Because the moment you have determined, let's say you want settlement blocks, in other words, you've said that anything that isn't in the settlement blocks can be negotiated over. And everything that we are willing to argue over or negotiate over will lose. And therefore, I suggest that we remove from our lexicon any partial program. If we're not talking about applying the law to all of the land of Israel, let's not talk about the law. Let's do it when we can. But we have to talk about applying the law to all of the land of Israel so that we won't, God forbid, be cut off from other parts. Congratulations to all the organizers. And with God's help, the people of Israel will see the cloud connected to the mountain, and we will see the people of Israel living in all parts of the land of Israel.